It was the same in Judaism. Once the kind of definition of what it meant to be Jewish was solidified, and paradoxically that was done in contradistinction to being Christian. There was a time in the very early times when Rabbi Yeshua was teaching, when people weren't quite sure what label to go with. Some would follow the rabbi, some would follow others, and there was much more fluidity and flexibility. But then after a while, after the great war between Rome and Judea, culminating in 70 AD in the destruction of Jerusalem and so on, it became a matter of life and death. And for their own self-preservation, the Jewish community defined itself as people that stuck to this set of rules, For me as a philosopher of religions, right, I have to look at all that process of system building and labelling and identity building as inevitable insofar as we humans still function within a tribal consciousness. The Japanese were doing it with Shintoism. There were great struggles between in the spread of the Roman Empire as to who was orthodox, who accepted the Roman religion, who was a heretic and outsider. For me as a philosopher, the only question to ask is what is the real truth behind all that stuff. So my interpretation, therefore, of texts which state only kind of words like the only Son of God or the only way, and all religions have them, by the way, it's not just Christianity. I mean, the Islamic version is Muhammad was the last prophet. That's the closure of the conversation. I mean, everything about Islam is very tolerant, very liberal. It affirms Judaism and Christianity, and if you read the Quran in a certain way, it affirms every other prophet that predated Muhammad, even the ones you'd never heard of. Muhammad says on record, seek knowledge even as far as China. The ink of the scholar is worth more than the blood of the martyr. It's an extremely knowledge-friendly faith, but then, clunk, Muhammad's the last prophet. So, there can be nothing beyond that, no extension of insight or thought. And instead what we have to do is sort of trot in behind Muhammad and just interpret his words, you see. Now, all the closures like that, all only positions, I think, have to be reinterpreted in this era of global consciousness that we're in now. And we have to realise this is like children. Children have these kind of disputes. I've got 3 daughters. They used to fight at tea party over who's got the only doll, or who's got the best doll, or who's got the nicest dress, or it's just human nature. But it's very childish. And as St. Paul said, in the old days I used to think as a child. Now I've grown up. I mean, Paul was a guy who went through the fire. He should have died many times over. He was attacked, vilified because he'd had a religious experience. He'd seen, the supernatural kingdoms. And he'd had a huge wake-up call to stop persecuting this dissident, rabbi's followers, which, much against his inclinations, turned him into one of the spokespeople for that early heretical movement, as it then was. So I think what he was going on about, for instance, is, and the Gospels that formed around that community, what they meant by saying that Christ was the only way was that if you're serious about the spiritual path, whatever your starting point on this planet, right? I don't care which box you start in, Shintoism, Bonpo, Druidry, whatever. If you're seriously intent on coming to a place of helping to rebuild mankind, getting into that redemptive work, if you want the messianic project of healing and purification, you'll kind of come to a place where you find yourself standing alongside other spiritual teachers from other lineages, and you're working together. So you'll bump into Christ along that journey. You'll bump into Buddha. You'll bump into Sufism and so on. Because they're all working together on the same route, on the same cause. So ultimately, there is only one path, I think, is what's being affirmed by all these texts. But the way those texts have been misapplied to persecute dissidents and heretics is itself the problem, which we need to grow out of in this global era. The only way we can do that is through some kind of a philosophical framework, like a meta-narrative system, that allows the existing micro-narratives to continue, affirms their truths and their wisdom, yet creates a kind of meta-narrative overarching them. And this is the work of transpersonal thinkers like Ken Wilber, which Jung laid the way for. If you look at the collective unconscious, you see what are the archetypes involved in each faith system. You see how they're all expressions of a global consciousness that's waiting to be born. That I think is the way to have the one and the many reconciled, and the only and the every reconciled.
Why do you spend almost every moment of your waking life on this path of first self-knowledge and also wanting to change the world and bring peace? Why can't you just sit down and watch TV like everybody else?
Well, it's a long story. You'd have to read my autobiography. But basically, when I was in my 19th year, I took a Buddhist tantric initiation on the Bodhisattva path. I woke up out of my kind of slumber of, brainwashing in a world which is all about horizontalism. There's no verticality allowed. We're brain fed through the media the kind of notion that there is no ultimate reality, there's no spirituality, there's just materiality. And I found that existentially unsatisfactory as a young adolescent. And I was one of those people that from quite a young age embarked on the quest to find the meaning of life. I didn't know it was called philosophy to begin with. I kind of discovered it the hard way. But once I discovered that there was this band of seekers over the centuries who've been called philosophers, who've asked the hard questions and sometimes pay with their lives for asking them. Often each culture and generation dispenses with people that ask difficult questions by just killing them off as heretics, I just felt that just a natural sympathy, a natural empathy for that project. I think I was reading about Spinoza actually when I was a young teenager. And the intensity with which Spinoza spent his life dedicated to this search. He called it the intellectual love of God. And he was ironically persecuted as a heretic by his own Jewish community because he dared to question the historicity of the Torah. He was the first guy to point out that the first books of the Bible couldn't have actually been written by Moses because, hang on, they cover Moses' death, Discovering people like that of intellectual integrity just made me realise, well, what are we doing now? What's the job to be done now? Now, in my day, when I was growing up, it was the threat of the Cold War and the nuclear arms race that was a kind of existential bombshell hanging over us as a civilization. And I was very involved in dialogue between East and West. I mean, when I launched Philosophers of Peace in the 80s, we used to have discussions in Notting Hill Gate, and different intellectuals, different academics would come together and discuss these things. In 1990, I went to Moscow to a conference of Philosophers of Peace, organised by an American philosopher called John Somerville, who'd written a book called The Philosophy of Peace back in the late 40s, with a foreword by Albert Einstein. And I met Somerville at a conference of philosophers in 1988 at the University of Sussex. And I was kind of basically elected president of Philosophers of Peace globally in 1990 at that conference. I've taken that responsibility quite seriously, That is quite a major thing to be doing. Because war, violence, genocide, firstly, our main task was the prevention of World War III and the nuclear arms race. Now, I think we played a small role, but significant role, by getting dialogue between Russia and the Soviet Union, as it then was, and the USA and Europe, among intellectuals and philosophers. We helped open up dialogue between these two rival systems. And it culminated in 1990 with the signing of the Treaty of Paris and the ending of the Cold War. Gorbachev, I think, was a kind of maverick philosopher in Russia at the time. And the situation of human rights improved in the Soviet Union. And I mean, I remember going to Moscow and meeting some incredible thinkers, intellectuals, who were just amazingly profound people that influenced me and inspired me. And the same in the States. You know, I've travelled a lot in America meeting philosophers and psychologists and peace workers. So, you know, why? Well, it's just obvious that's the work to be done.